Hey everyone, it's just been a while since I made a video on some things I've been studying or reading, and today I'm going to just share some things that I've read and learned from the Jewish Gospels by Daniel Boyarins. I've read this book many times before, but I've never started taking notes on it until now. Daniel Boyarins is an Orthodox Jew, and he challenges a lot of assumptions that many of us have had, or do have about Christianity and Judaism. Now, the historical story is if you're Jewish, you can't believe in Jesus, and if you're Christian, you can't observe the Sabbath or something like that. There's strict borderlines historically. Much of this really took place when Rome adopted Christianity as the state religion in the 4th century. The Christianity we know today is because of that. If we look before that, the Christianity of the 1st, 2nd, 3rd century was a sect within Judaism, and there is a lot of proof of that. Jews and Gentiles congregate together in the synagogues or whatever, but it was a Jewish sect, and it shouldn't be surprising because Judaism in ancient times was very broad. There were several different sects. After the destruction of the temple, the Pharisees are the ones who took over, and that's what we have known today as Rabbinic Judaism. But in the 1st century, that was just one sect. And of course, after Rome took over Christianity and made it the religion of the state, that's when strict borderlines were set up. There is no proof of any strong, concrete divisions between a religion known as Judaism and a religion known as Christianity in the 1st, 2nd century, not in the 2nd century, and not in the 3rd century either. No proof, contrary to what many Christians and pastors will teach from the pulpit. No proof, none. And he did cause a firestorm when he said this stuff because he is challenging long-held assumptions. And another long-held assumption he challenges and shows a lot of proof that these ideas are very false is the Son of God, Son of Man terminology. And he explains that usually in our Western mind, that the Son of Man is usually seen as a human title of Jesus, and the Son of God was seen as the divine title. And to our minds, it's not that far of a throw to actually think in these terms. But he said we've switched these up. The Son of God title was a title for the King of Israel. And there's even proof of this in the 2nd Psalm. Now, this psalm is quoted in the New Testament as alluding to Jesus as the Messiah, but we have to remember these are midrashic. They're not literal. Literally, the 2nd Psalm says, let's see, right here. It says, I have set up my king on Mount Zion, my holy mountain. I will declare the decree of Adonai. He said to me, you are my son. Today I have become your father. Now, Hebrews quotes this, and I believe in other places in the New Testament it's quoted too, but we have to remember that the apostles were using scripture midrashically. It's not literal. This psalm right here literally is not about the Messiah. It is literally about the King of Israel. Now, the Messiah is the King of Israel, but this is not literally a messianic psalm in its original historical context. It is about the king that God establishes on Israel. Why was he called the Son of God? Well, God not ruling literally on the earth, he set up a king to rule in his place. That's why he's called his son, because he's the second in command, pretty much. He's sitting on earth, he's sitting on God's throne, ruling God's people. That's why he's called the Son of God. And Daniel Boyarins even points out that the way Mark's gospel opens up, this is the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. It could also be taken as this is the gospel of Jesus Christ, the King of Israel. because the term Son of God does not mean some literal son. It means the Messianic King, the King. And also, the term Messiah it's a loaded word, but it just doesn't refer to some supernatural divine figure who's going to come and save the world from an apocalyptic destruction or save people and give salvation. The term Messiah just means anointed. There's a lot of people that are anointed in the Bible, particularly the kings. All the kings were messiahs, literally, if you really want to use the word in its literal sense. David was a messiah, Solomon was a messiah, King Hezekiah. All of them were. They were all anointed by a prophet. They were all messiahs. And this is just something that needs to get out there, because a lot of Christians just don't know this. They just grow up with assumptions or things they hear in the pulpit, things they grow in the church. And people like me who have actually studied things after, they grew up in the church, but they start studying things, real things. They're not reading dogma from evangelical fundamentalist pastors. They're reading real knowledge, things that are taught in universities and colleges by professors. A lot of stuff we're taught growing up is completely false. All of it. And what I really love what he gets into is in the Mark 7 dispute about the hand-washing dispute in Mark 7. And I'll just read the short story here because it is pretty short. But as Daniel Boyarins points out, there is a missing verse here, verse 16. It's in all the ancient manuscripts, but it was later removed. And it's quite obvious that verse 16 in this story was removed to just completely turn the entire meaning of the story upside down. They took the verse out, and the verse is very simple and very short. It just says, "He who has ears to hear, let him hear." And we all know that this is something he said directly before or directly after a parable. And this passage, he doesn't give a traditional literal parable, but he speaks not literally, and that's why it's called a parable. But basically, this story went from Jesus upholding kosher food laws to him not upholding kosher food laws. And this version is from the TLV, the Tree of Life version, which I do really like. I don't agree with a lot of the theology of the publisher, but this version of the Bible is amazing. And let's see, it says, "Now the Pharisees and some of the Torah scholars who had come from Jerusalem gathered around Yeshua, and they saw that some of his disciples were eating bread with unclean hands, that is, not washed. For the Pharisees and all the Jewish people do not eat unless they wash their hands up to the elbow, keeping the tradition of the elders. And when they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they perform a ritual washing. There are many other traditions that they have received and hold, such as the washing of cups, pitchers, and copper vessels." The Pharisees and the Torah scholars questioned Yeshua, "Why don't your disciples walk according to the tradition of the elders? Why do they eat bread with unwashed hands?" And he said to them, "Rightly did Isaiah prophesy about you, hypocrites, as it is written, 'This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. And in vain they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. Having left behind the commandment of God, you hold on to the tradition of men.'" He was also telling them, "You set aside the commands of God in order that you may validate your own tradition. For Moses said, 'Honor your father and mother,' and he who speaks evil of father or mother must be put to death. Then you no longer..." Oh, excuse me. I skipped a verse. "But you say, if anyone tells father or mother, 'Whatever you might have gained from me is korban,' that is an offering to God, then you no longer permit him to do anything for his father or mother, making void the word of God with your tradition that you've handed down, and you do many such things." Then Yeshua called the crowd again and began saying to them, "Hear me, everyone, and understand. There is nothing outside the man that can make him unholy by going into him. Rather, it is what comes out of the man that makes him unholy. And then here is the missing phantom verse right after this. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. When he had left the crowd and entered the house, his disciples questioned him about the parable. And that's another thing. When you take out verse 16 here, where's the parable? There is no parable. But when verse 16 is added back in, they question him about the parable. It makes perfect sense. And he said to them, are you then also lacking understanding? Don't you grasp that whatever goes into a man cannot make him unholy, for it does not enter into the heart, but into the stomach, and then goes out into the sewer, cleansing all foods. Now, most people here say most versions will say Jesus declared all foods clean. It's not in the text at all. It doesn't belong there. It should not be there in any version. It's not there. What the Greek words here actually mean is purging all foods, cleansing all foods that goes through the body and comes out. The words, thus Jesus declared all foods clean, are not in any Greek text. And he continues, it is what comes out of the man that makes the man unholy, for from within, out of the heart of man, comes evil thoughts and intentions, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, wickedness, deceit, lustfulness, envy, slander, pride, and foolishness. All these evil things come from within and make the man unholy. Now, I'll say that Yeshua, was a very traditional Jew. He, contrary to a lot of teaching that's out there, he was a rabbi. He upheld and lived by a lot of the rabbinic traditions, but this he seems to be against it. Not that he was against the hand washing necessarily, but there was a lot of issues here that are behind the text that if you're not Jewish or educated in Jewish things and practices of the time, you're not even going to know. But I did take notes down from Daniel Boyarins' chapter in this book, Jesus Kept Kosher, and I'm just going to read them off because he makes some very good points here. And he says, counter to most views of the matter, according to the Gospel of Mark, Jesus kept kosher. He did not see himself as abrogating Torah, but defending it. There was controversy with some Jewish leaders on how to observe the Torah, but never whether to observe the Torah. According to Mark, far from abandoning the laws of Torah, Jesus was a staunch defender of Torah against what he perceived to be threats to it from the Pharisees. Jesus was not fighting against Judaism, he was fighting within it. Purity laws and dietary laws are two different things. Purity and dietary are just two completely different things. In the Christian mind, they're often seen as the same thing, clean and unclean. But they're not. They're two completely different things. Kosher laws apply to all Jews everywhere and always. Purity laws do not. The Pharisees taught that eating kosher food that had been in contact with impurities renders it impure, and this goes against the intended meaning of the Torah. Jesus rejects the Pharisaic extension of the purity laws beyond their specific biblical foundations. He is not rejecting Torah, but upholding the Torah. Jesus and Torah agree that it is what goes into the body that defiles, but what comes out. Fluxes of blood, semen, gonorrhea, these things come out of the body and they defile the man, the person. Nothing that goes in is able to defile you. This is a long-held Torah teaching. The only food according to Torah that renders a body impure is carrion, decaying flesh of dead animals. And in effect, when the Pharisees taught that if you didn't wash your hands, you defiled your food and it defiled your body because you put it in your body, they were actually changing the Torah. In effect, by keeping this tradition and upholding this tradition, they were changing the Torah, and that is what Jesus was so angry about, because the Torah comes directly from God. As a faithful Jew, he believed that. He lived by it. And the Pharisees, in effect, by adding this extension to it, were not only abrogating the Torah, but they were changing the Torah in his mind. And even according to the Talmud, it was the rabbis who innovated the washing of hands before meals, which implies that the ingesting of defiled or polluted food renders one impure. So, I mean, this was not a established, set down rule in the first century. It was still being debated. But today it's completely accepted. And according to the Torah, that which comes out of the body, fluxes of various types, can contaminate, not foods that go in. Thus, if the Pharisees argue that food itself contaminates, that is a change in the law they have added to Torah, which is extremely prohibited by the very words of the Torah. Do not add, do not take away. And the attack on hand washing in the story is moreover consistent with Jesus' subsequent attack on the vow that releases from supporting one's parents. Remember the passage where he said, but you say anything that you have gained to me is korban, an offering. Well, the Pharisees, some of them had taught that if your parents were elderly and they were living with you and you were by law in the Torah, you had to support your parents, honor your parents. It doesn't mean to just sit there and say, I honor you. When they get old enough to where they can't work anymore, it's your responsibility at that time to financially support your parents. Give them a place to live, which is usually with you. You were to put food on the table for them, put clothes on their back. You were supposed to take care of them. And the Pharisees taught that you could take all that money and give it to an offering as God. And not only were you not able, or not only were you not supposed to, you were free from the obligation to take care of parents if you took all that money and gave it to the temple as a sacrifice, but they said you were actually prohibited from doing that. So if you gave all that money that you were supposed to give to your parents as an offering, not only were you not obligated to do that, you were actually prohibited from taking care of your parents after that. And this is what made Yeshua so angry, because they had changed the law. They had changed Torah through this tradition. They've made it void. And Jesus accuses the Pharisees of having abandoned the plain sense of the Torah. And I agree with this. I can see where he's coming from. The plain, literal meaning of the Torah. They have added so much tradition onto this that at times it seems like they had just completely gotten so far away from the original intended meaning that it's just ridiculous. And Jesus did reject the extra stringent laws of defiled foods to which the Pharisees were so devoted. These aren't kosher laws, though. Mark's word translated says, purifying all foods. There is no reason why this should be taken to mean, thus he permitted all foods, or thus Jesus declared all foods clean. The best way to translate this is, thus he purified all foods. It is not likely that Mark's audience would have understood Jesus as having abrogated the rules of forbidden and permitted animals. In effect, Jesus is saying, why does the Torah only render impure that which comes out and not that which goes in, if not to teach us that morality is more important than the purity regulations, and especially the Pharisaic extensions of them? This is not abrogating Torah, but keeping it in its proper place. A close reading of Mark 7 suggests that Jesus speaks from the position of a traditional Galilean Jew, one whose community and practices are being criticized and interfered with from outside by the Judeans. The Pharisees were based in Judea. As is emphasized in the opening sentence of this story, the Galileans were antipathetic to the urban Judean Jerusalemite Pharisaic extensions. And I would also add that we have a few other problems here from a Jewish perspective that are of issue. Number one, Jesus is a rabbi. He has his own school of disciples, and they are publicly humiliating the disciples. Why do your disciples not keep the tradition of the elders? And they're intruding on his territory. These are his disciples, not theirs, his. They are putting themselves in his place, trying to tell the disciples what to do. And it's public humiliation, which is a very serious sin. in Judaism, extremely so. They're asking, why are your disciples not keeping with the tradition of the elders when this is not their place? And they're supposed to be taking them off in private somewhere and asking them this if they bring up the issue at all. But the basic issue here is Jesus did not do away with kosher laws, and there's nothing in this story that suggests that. Basically, what happened was after Rome adopted the Christian religion as its state religion, Gentiles love eating pig and other unclean animals. So they wanted to look for a reason to where Jesus said somewhere that they could eat what they want. So we have the story in Mark, but they had to take out the 16th verse in it to back up their theology. So they had to take the story and turn it completely upside down. And that's what taking this verse out does. But I think that's about it. I just wish more people were more open-minded to this stuff. Take care. That's it.